coming from Homer, which is ancient Greece. The classical age of Athenian drama is remarkably different. A lot of the same stories are the same. They're dealing with the same basic cast of characters. They're still just rehashing myths that were already quite old when, when the Iliad and the Odyssey were written. But the sensibilities are different. The issues are evolved. At this point, you're dealing with highly sophisticated civilizations, primarily the civilization of Athens, which pretty much alone out of Greek city-states achieved a significant level of artistic sophistication, but also political. They went through a period of kings, although the word they tended to use, which has changed a little bit since then, is tyrants. And they had some early famous experiments with democracy. The Greeks are credited with largely inventing democracy as an early forerunner of modern democracy. The specifics of it get a little foggy, but it was essentially a participatory government where if you were male, not a slave, and a citizen of Athens, and they kept a pretty tight rein on citizenry, then you could participate in government. You could vote for stuff. You could. They had some sort of elections, and it was considered an obligation and an honor to take part in the civic life of Athens. But that's not necessarily always a good thing. And you see a lot of criticism of this system. This newfangled way of doing things, didn't have much tradition behind it, so people were a little skeptical of it. If you have really smart people running things, that's generally good. If you have everybody trying to run things, not everybody tends to be really smart. And so you could argue that the level of wisdom in any respective decision starts to drop. But of course, really smart people can also be jackasses, as kings have always been. So this is a conflict that you see playing out. What it is a conflict, however, of sophistication. It's no longer the debate that we saw in Homer of a culture struggling to come out of barbarism and adopt some form of civilization. Now you're seeing an active and developed civilization trying to look around and say, well, okay, how do we reform ourselves? How do we clean up our act? How do we take this experiment and make it better? Or how do we correct some of the wrongs and the oversights in what we were trying to do initially? And that's where drama comes in. Initially, these plays, and there were a lot of them. We don't have that many of them surviving. Initially, they tended to be part of festivals, generally religious festivals, Greek gods in honor of, yada, yada, yada. Lots of people would show up and they would have contests. And who puts on the best play? And that would be, a big organizing principle for the production of plays. They would write them specifically for these festivals. And they tended to be about the myths and legends of Greek history, keeping everything in that distant, faraway past that everybody was familiar with. Everybody knew the stories. Everybody had that baked into their memories from early on. And the writers could rely on that. People could fill in a lot of blanks because it's very complicated when you have all of these characters and heroes and gods jostling around. But at the same time, by putting it back there, by putting it in this abstract, distant, faraway concept of a past, they could write on a couple of different levels. You can write, as we saw to a degree in Homer, criticism of your current situation by having things play out in a distant past. You can arrange stories so that they comment on or make people at least think about the present, the problems that they have then, and which by and large we have now. The really good plays, and again, we have only a fraction of them, but the really good plays, I would assume, have that sort of resonance, have that timeless capacity to say, wow, this speaks to me, and it's like he wrote it just yesterday, because it has that significance. I would argue that the plays that we do have perhaps did that better than those that we don't, because we still have them. And again, caring for these things, preserving these documents, that takes some effort. And if something falls away just because, it was stupid, it didn't really say much, or it's kind of dated, people don't really come back to it so often. But those that we do have, you can see very timeless issues, questions of justice prevailingly, questions of ethics, questions of how we get along. And they're exploring these old myths that, again, had been told for centuries at this point. Some of the same stories that Homer relied on pop up here. And they're always cast in ways that are fresh. Partly through changing them here and there. A lot of the myths, because they started out as oral storytelling, tended to be a little flexible in the details, and the facts can get jumbled around. Creative license. The Greeks were allowed to use it too. So you get a lot of stories where it's like one way in the ancient stuff, in Homer and all that, but then key details seem to shift around in the plays and raise questions. Well, why did they do that? Why is that different? What is going on here? What is the effect of changing just this one little detail? These are the questions that we're supposed to ask. These are questions that are fun to ask, quite frankly. Greek drama is also fairly current or popular in today's market. You can go see pretty much at any point in time a Greek play, not quite on Broadway, but off Broadway. They are produced with some regularity. In contrast to the great successor civilization to the Greeks is the Romans, you can live your entire lifetime and not see, you know, an advertisement for somebody putting on a play of the Roman playwright Terence, for instance. Terence is great. Nobody ever puts him on, you know? The Greeks, constantly. I think there's a Medea on Broadway right now, Rose Byrne and Bobby Cannavale. Liberally adapted, but it's there. One of the great qualities of Greek theater is that it's so spare and can be fairly liberally adapted. We don't have a lot of specifics about it other than the dialogue. Even in these editions we have here, the stage directions tend to be added by editors. There's an awful lot of freedom in terms of how many characters are on the stage at any one time. Usually in the original versions, these plays were written for like 2, maybe 3 actors. And in modern productions, especially when you're dealing with like crowd scenes, you know, they can boost it up and have a lot more. Makes it a little more exciting. But it gives you that freedom. There's not a lot going on. It's just dialogue driven. And when you get modern theater techniques added to that, you can have a lot of fun with it. And so it starts to become relevant. Some more than others, but it's a way of reinterpreting and refreshing the art as it comes along. And that's part of what makes it fun.